Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's, I think, pretty relevant to all of us, no matter what field you're in, fraud risks. And, we've got a ton of great material to dig into from a podcast that's actually designed for new compliance officers.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so it's like, Fraud 101.
Hmm.
But I gotta tell you, even with all my years in this business, I still learn a few things that surprised me.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, for one thing, I always thought of fraud as something that mainly happened in those like big corporations, the ones you see in the headlines.
Right.
But it turns out fraud can happen anywhere.
Really?
Yeah, small businesses, nonprofits, you name it. It's like a chameleon. It can blend in anywhere.
Wow, that's a little unsettling.
Yeah, it is kind of. But hey, that's why we're doing this deep dive, right? To arm ourselves with the knowledge to spot it and stop it.
Exactly. Knowledge is power.
So let's get right into it. The podcast we're looking at today really emphasized how diverse fraud can be. I mean, they covered everything from financial statement fraud, like cooking the books,
Right.
to asset misappropriation, which is basically employees stealing from the company.
Stealing straight up.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's good old-fashioned bribery and corruption.
Ah, the classics.
And then you've got the whole world of cyber fraud, which is like a whole other beast.
Oh, it's like fraud on steroids.
Seriously. So what's interesting is that this huge variety of fraud types, it's not just an academic thing. It directly impacts all of us.
How so?
Well, because it means we can't just focus on one type of fraud. We need to be prepared for a much wider range of risks than we might initially think.
That makes sense.
They got-
So it's not enough to just know the basics. We need to understand the whole spectrum of possibilities.
Exactly. It's like being a detective for your own organization.
I like that.
You got to be able to spot clues and connect the dots no matter what form the fraud takes.
But how do we even begin to do that?
Well, the podcast had some great advice on that. They talked about the importance of something called fraud risk assessment.
Okay, fraud risk assessment. What does that entail?
It's basically a way to proactively identify potential vulnerabilities before they can be exploited.
Sounds like a good place to start.
Right. It's all about asking the right questions. Like, have there been any past incidents of fraud in our organization? Are there any patterns of behavior that might be red flags? Are there any processes that are particularly vulnerable to manipulation?
So it's about looking for weaknesses in our systems and procedures.
Exactly. And the podcast highlighted some specific red flags that we should be on the lookout for.
Like what?
Well, for instance, unusual or unauthorized transactions, especially those that fall outside of normal business practices.
Okay, so anything that seems out of the ordinary.
Right. And then another one is sudden unexplained lifestyle changes in employees, particularly if those changes don't seem to align with their salary.
So like someone suddenly driving a fancy new car when they were barely making ends meet before.
Exactly. That's a big red flag.
Right.
And then, of course, a lack of oversight or accountability can also be a breeding ground for fraud.
Makes sense. If there's no one watching, people are more likely to take advantage.
Exactly. And another big one is excessive secrecy surrounding certain activities or transactions.
Oh yeah, someone's being super secretive about what they're doing. That's definitely a cause for concern.
Right. It could be an attempt to hide something. So basically, we need to be vigilant. We need to be aware of these red flags, and we need to be willing to ask questions if something doesn't seem right.
It's like we need to develop a healthy dose of paranoia.
Haha, maybe a little.
Yeah.
But seriously, it's better to be safe than sorry when it comes to fraud.
Absolutely. So
Okay.
once we've identified these potential risks, what do we do next?
Well, that's where the real work begins, building what a podcast called a fraud-resistant fortress for our organization.
A fortress, huh? Sounds impressive. Tell me more.
They emphasize three key elements. The first is establishing robust internal controls.
Internal controls.
Yeah, okay. Think of these as like the walls of your fortress. The policies, procedures, and systems that are put in place to help safeguard assets and prevent fraud.
So it's about having strong defenses in place.
Exactly. And the second element is creating a culture of compliance through effective employee training and awareness programs.
Training our troops, so to
Right.
speak.
Exactly. We need to equip our team with the knowledge and tools they need to recognize and report potential fraud.
Makes sense. We need everyone to be on the lookout.
Right. And then the third element is conducting thorough background checks on all employees and vendors.
Vetting the people who are coming into our fortress.
Precisely. It's all about due diligence, making sure that we're not letting any bad actors in.
Okay, so we've got our walls, our trained guards, and our vetting process. What else?
Well, there are a lot of specific internal controls that can be put in place, but one of the most powerful ones that they highlighted is the principle of segregation of duties.
Segregation of duties. I'm not familiar with that one.
It's basically about making sure that no single person has complete control over a critical process, especially when it comes to financial transactions.
Oh, I see. So, like, you wouldn't want the same person who approves invoices to also be the one who cuts the checks.
Exactly. You need multiple people involved in key tasks like approving invoices, making payments, reconciling accounts.
So it's like having multiple locks on a vault. You need multiple keys to open it.
That's a great analogy. And I've actually seen firsthand what can happen when this principle is ignored.
Oh, really? Tell me about it.
Well, early in my career, I worked at a company where a single employee had control over both approving and processing expense reimbursements.
Oh, that sounds like trouble.
It was. This employee took advantage of the situation and submitted numerous fraudulent expense reports, pocketing thousands of dollars before they were eventually caught.
Wow. So even with a strong culture of integrity, things can still slip through the cracks.
Unfortunately, yes. But that's why it's so important to have these checks and balances in place.
Right. It's about making it as difficult as possible for someone to commit fraud without being detected.
Exactly. But even with the best defenses in place, can't frauds still happen?
That's a great question. And it's something that we'll be diving into more deeply in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned. So even with all these precautions, fraud can still happen.
It's true. Even the best defenses can be breached.
So what do we do then?
Well, that's where the concept of detection and response comes in. It's not enough to just try to prevent fraud. We also need to be prepared to detect it early and respond effectively.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do we go about detecting fraud if it does happen?
Well, the podcast highlighted the importance of data analytics as a powerful tool for fraud detection.
Data analytics. Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not really sure what it means in this context.
It's essentially about using technology to analyze large volumes of data and look for patterns and anomalies that might indicate fraud.
So like using computers to sift through mountains of information and find the needle in the haystack?
Exactly. Data analytics can be used to flag things like unusual spending patterns, duplicate invoices, transactions that fall outside of normal business hours, all sorts of things that might raise a red flag.
Wow. So it's like having a superpowered detective who can analyze millions of pieces of information in the blink of an eye.
That's a great way to put it. But it's important to remember that data analytics is just a tool. It's not a magic bullet.
Right. That's not going to catch every instance of fraud.
Exactly. We still need human judgment and expertise to interpret the results and decide whether further investigation is warranted.
So it's not about replacing human detectives with robots. It's about giving our human detectives the best possible tools to do their job.
Precisely. And data analytics is most effective when it's combined with a strong understanding of your organization's specific risks and vulnerabilities. That's where your fraud risk assessment comes in.
Right, because if you know where your weak spots are, you can use data analytics to target those areas and look for any suspicious activity.
Exactly. It's all about being strategic and focusing your resources where they're most likely to have an impact.
That makes a lot of sense. But what about those situations where fraud does occur, despite our best efforts to prevent and detect it? What steps should we take to respond effectively?
Well, the podcast emphasized the importance of having a clear and well-defined incident response plan in place. This plan should outline the steps that need to be taken in the event of a suspected or confirmed fraud incident.
So it's like having a fire drill for fraud. Everyone knows their role and what to do in case of emergency.
Exactly. And just like with a fire drill, it's important to practice your incident response plan regularly so that everyone is prepared and knows what to do if the alarm bells go off.
And speed is of the essence, right? The longer it takes to detect and respond to fraud, the more damage it can do.
Absolutely. Early detection and rapid response are crucial for minimizing losses and preventing further damage. And that's why it's so important to encourage employees to report any suspicions they may have, even if they're not entirely sure whether something is truly amiss.
So it's about creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up, even if it turns out to be a false alarm.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of a whistleblower program comes in. This is a confidential channel that allows employees to report concerns anonymously without fear of retaliation.
So it's like a safety net for catching those instances of fraud that might otherwise slip through the cracks.
It is. And it's important to remember that fraud can happen anywhere, at any level of an organization. Even the most trusted employees can succumb to temptation or pressure. That's why it's crucial to have multiple layers of defense, including a strong whistleblower program.
Okay, so we've talked about prevention, detection, and response. But I have a feeling there's more to this than just implementing the right policies and procedures. It seems like there's a human element to this as well, wouldn't you say?
You're absolutely right. The podcast really hammered home the point that building a culture of integrity is just as important as having strong internal controls and robust detection mechanisms.
Okay, let's unpack that. What does a culture of integrity look like in practice? It sounds a bit abstract.
It's about creating an environment where doing the right thing is not just expected, but ingrained in the very fabric of the organization. It's about fostering a sense of shared responsibility for ethical conduct, where everyone feels empowered to speak up against wrongdoing.
So it's not just about following the rules because you have to, it's about doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
Precisely. And that kind of culture starts at the top. Leaders need to set the tone by demonstrating ethical behavior in their own actions and decisions. They need to be transparent and accountable, and they need to create an environment where employees feel comfortable raising concerns without fear of retribution.
It sounds like it's about creating a culture of trust where everyone feels valued and respected, and where honesty and integrity are prized above all else.
That's a great way to put it. And the benefits of a strong culture of integrity extend far beyond just preventing fraud. It can lead to increased employee morale, improved customer loyalty, and a stronger reputation in the marketplace.
It's amazing how something as seemingly intangible as integrity can have such a tangible impact on an organization's success.
It really is. And the podcast shared a really compelling example of how a company's culture of integrity helped them weather a major fraud scandal.
Oh, wow. Tell me more.
Well, this company had a long-standing reputation for ethical conduct and strong corporate governance. But even with the best of intentions, they fell victim to a sophisticated fraud scheme perpetrated by a high-level executive.
So even with a strong culture of integrity, fraud can still happen.
Unfortunately, yes. But here's the key takeaway. Because this company had fostered an environment of transparency and open communication, the fraud was detected relatively quickly. And because they had a clear incident response plan in place, they were able to contain the damage and take swift action to hold the perpetrator accountable.
So their culture of integrity didn't prevent the fraud, but it helped them to mitigate the impact and emerge from the crisis stronger than before.
Exactly. And it also sent a clear message to their employees, customers, and investors that they were committed to doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. Their reputation remained intact, and they were able to rebuild trust to move forward.
That's a powerful example of how integrity can be a company's greatest asset, even in the face of adversity. But I'm curious, how do you actually go about building this kind of culture? It sounds like a tall order.
It is, but it's not impossible. The podcast emphasized the importance of clear communication, consistent messaging, and ongoing training and development programs that reinforce ethical values and decision-making.
So it's about weaving integrity into the very DNA of the organization, from the hiring process to performance evaluations to everyday interactions.
Absolutely. And it's an ongoing journey, not a destination. It requires constant vigilance and a commitment from everyone at every level of the organization.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the nuts and bolts of internal controls to the more philosophical aspects of building a culture of integrity. It's been quite a deep dive.
I agree. It's been fascinating to explore all these different facets of fraud risk management. And I think we've gleaned some really valuable insights from this podcast.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, I want to pose a question to you, our listener, to really get you thinking. Imagine you've just been tasked with creating a comprehensive fraud risk management program for your organization. Where would you even begin? What would be your first steps?
It's a great question to ponder, and it really gets to the heart of what we've been discussing today. Taking proactive steps to protect your organization from this ever-present threat.
It's a lot to think about, isn't it? I mean, where do you even start?
Well, I think the key is to not get overwhelmed. Approach it strategically, one step at a time.
Okay, so break it down for me. What would be the first step?
The podcast actually had a really good suggestion. They said the first step is to conduct a thorough fraud risk assessment.
Okay, a fraud risk assessment. We talked about that a little bit earlier.
Right. It's all about identifying your organization's specific vulnerabilities. The areas where you're most susceptible to fraud.
And this isn't a one-time thing, is it?
Nope, not at all. It's something you need to revisit regularly as your business evolves and the fraud landscape changes.
So it's like taking inventory of your defenses and making sure they're up to date and strong enough to withstand the latest threats.
Exactly. Once you have a clear understanding of your risks, you can then start to develop targeted strategies to mitigate them.
And those strategies could involve things like strengthening internal controls, implementing new technologies like data analytics, enhancing employee training programs.
Right. It's all about being proactive, anticipating potential problems before they arise.
But let's face it, sometimes fraud does happen, even with the best prevention efforts in place.
That's true, which is why it's so important to have a plan in place for those times when it does.
A plan. So what kind of plan are we talking about here?
They call it an incident response plan. It basically outlines the steps that need to be taken in the event of a suspected or confirmed fraud incident.
So like who to notify, how to preserve evidence, how to conduct a thorough investigation.
Exactly. It's like having a fire drill for fraud. Yeah. You want to be prepared to act quickly and decisively to contain the damage.
And I imagine communication is key in these situations.
Absolutely. Transparency is essential.
Mm.
You need to be upfront with your employees, your customers, your investors about what happened, what steps you're taking to address the situation, and what you're doing to prevent it from happening again.
So honesty and integrity are really the best policies when it comes to dealing with fraud.
Without a doubt. But is there anything else we can do to kind of cultivate that culture of integrity we talked about earlier? I mean, beyond clear communication and ethical leadership.
Well, the podcast actually suggested something pretty interesting. They recommended creating a code of ethics for your organization.
A code of ethics.
Hmm.
You know, at first I thought that sounded kind of old-fashioned.
Yeah, me too. But then I thought about it and I realized it could actually be a really powerful tool.
Right. It can help set clear expectations and reinforce those ethical values.
Exactly. It's like a compass that helps employees navigate those gray areas where it's not always clear what the right thing to do is.
And it's not enough to just have it written down somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, it needs to be embedded in your culture, reinforced through training and communication.
It needs to be something that everyone in the organization lives by from the top down.
Precisely. It's about creating an environment where integrity is not just a buzzword, but a way of life.
And that kind of environment is not only more ethical, it's also more resilient to fraud.
Exactly. Because when everyone is committed to doing the right thing, it creates a powerful deterrent against wrongdoing.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. And I have to say, I'm feeling a lot more informed and a lot less overwhelmed than I was when we started.
Me too. It's been a really valuable deep dive.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us. We hope you found this deep dive insightful and maybe even a little bit empowering.
Remember, knowledge is power. And when it comes to fraud risk management, the more you know, the better equipped you'll be to protect yourself and your organization.
So stay curious, stay vigilant, and never underestimate the power of human intuition and ethical awareness.
Great advice. Until next time, everyone.
Bye for now.